Hello, welcome to PodRocket. I'm Noel. With me today is Tejas Kumar. He is the Director of Developer Relations at Zada, keynote speaker, angel investor, YouTuber, a whole bunch of stuff. And we'll try to cover as much of that as we can. How are you doing today, Tejas?
I'm doing fantastic. I love it. I'm happy to be here and chat about all the things we're going to talk about and just have a good time.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah. So again, I kind of just like to turn the floor over to our guests when they're on, to kind of tell us about themselves and their background and how they got to where they are now. Like how'd you find yourself as a developer relations professional?
That's a great question. I didn't actually start as a DevRel person, so I started as a front end developer, just because I was so fascinated by like, whoa, I just write HTML and open it in a browser and I see stuff, right? That feedback loop, that is the magic. Just like having this rapid feedback loop. um, and spent many years kind of working as a front end engineer. Really got to appreciate like the complexity there, which is so unique because you work on systems that are way outside your control. Like different browsers, different network conditions, different all kinds of things, different people with like color blindness and so many variables. Um, and so I did that for a few years, and eventually like I kept coming back to the same frustration, which is I'm blocked, and it's because the backend is not ready. There was a lot of times where I was like just waiting on backend stuff, and I thought, you know what, let's just pivot and become a backend engineer to see what the delay is about. um, and did that for a few years, mostly with like Node.js backends and Postgres databases and stuff. um, and I got to appreciate that like the backend is something it's really important to get right, from a security and privacy standpoint, but it has way less variables than like front end. Like you control the machines, you control, or at least your ops team will control like the infrastructure and stuff, so it's way more controlled, um, which I appreciate a lot over the front end world. And then from there moved to the infrastructure side, so things like Kubernetes and AWS and stuff like that. Did that for like a couple years. And then at some point, so my last thing before DevRel was I was working at Spotify, kind of just as a general software engineer across the whole stack, and we were working on like deploying a database with high availability and failover, like if US East is down, like some other region needs to pick up the slack, this kind of thing. Um, and then one day I randomly found a DM from the founder of Zada, where I work right now. And she said, "Hey, I have this like young company. We're like 6 people. Do you want to join us as DevRel?" And I said, "Yeah, let's do it." Like in the interview, she made a really good point. She was like, "We could hire you to do engineering. We could hire a lot of engineers, but what we haven't found is like someone who speaks about stuff like you. That is unique. Like there's no one else we could hire." So like she and the CTO said to me, they were like, "I think you'd be well suited to DevRel in this company." And I was like, "Wow, okay, no one's ever said that. Awesome, let's do it." And so that's kind of how I ended up doing DevRel as my full time thing.
Nice. So were the like existing channels that they found, were those like your YouTube videos and that content, or where were you kind of filling this niche before?
Yeah, it was definitely not YouTube content. I still like I do YouTube stuff like almost irregularly, just because like hardware is hard to set up and tear down, and lights and cameras and all this. But what I love doing, what I've loved doing since 2009, was just speaking at events. Like a lot of people are afraid of like public speaking. I enjoy it, and also I've been writing code for a very long time. So like I'll speak and I'll do some coding and stuff on stage to show people, things that I think are cool. And I've been doing that a lot, especially before the apocalypse. Uh, lots of public speaking.
Nice. That's kind of a good segue into a recent talk you have done or are about to begin. I'm not sure which it is, but one that you were kind of wanting to talk to us about. What is that? What is that topic?
Yeah, that's at Belgium JS. There's a
Hmm.
That's an upcoming conference this week. I'm
Oh,
talking about
nice. Perfect.
I'm talking about the next evolution of data infrastructure for JavaScript developers. Yeah,
Gotcha. What is that? What is the next evolution?
that's a good question. I think the
Yeah.
next evolution is to reduce data infrastructure to a serverless API. I think the short answer is serverless. I think it's been taking the world by storm with things like Jamstack and functions, and like Cloudflare just today announced open sourcing their workers runtime, which is another serverless offering. So like I think that's definitely the next evolution. It used to be like we'd have servers that we'd provision and scale as we need, even at the database level, even at the data infrastructure level. And I think slowly everything's just moving to someone else manage this for me so I can build my thing.
Right. Yeah, I feel like there's kind of a few players in that space. Like we've been creeping this way a little bit, right? Like we have like very managed SQL or whatever, like relational databases that the cloud host will set up for you, and then you can just like plug that connector in, and then we have like the fire stores, things like attached to the suites that I can just like write data to and get data from. Do you feel like we're kind of on this path already, or do you think we're about to hit an inflection point where it's really going to take off even more?
I think, as you said, we've been kind of like we've been moving towards it like LA traffic, like like slowly. Um, I don't know if we're at an inflection point or if we're actually in the middle of the inflection point, to be fair. But I do think the degree of how much control we're willing to give away in exchange for convenience, that is growing rapidly. Because like a lot of the players in this field, even they'll give you like a hosted database, but you will still have to usually like connect to it and then build an API into it, for example. And I think we're going to see more of people saying, you know what, if you give me an API, I'm more than comfortable like having you deal with my authentication and all of the API things as well in exchange for convenience and money.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I'm trying to think where. So when we talk about like authentication and things that are not just like read the simple case of like reading and writing data, it's like sure, well, that's not that interesting if like there's nothing else we're doing around it. The hard part of the database is like controlling access, like who gets access to what, how do we figure out who can read what, and make that timely. How do we solve those problems? In an environment like the front end where dev doesn't want to like go through that overhead of setting up like the things that were necessitated to be on the back end before.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly the evolution I'm talking about. Is like let's imagine if you wanted to do that today, right? I know so many companies that are doing this exactly this like access control and authorization at the database level. They're doing it so differently. Like there's a company called Guild, brand new company, and what they're doing is they're using Postgres to like control all of that. Like Postgres has first class support for authorization using SQL, so they're just like straight on the database. And then there's another company. I don't know if I'm allowed to even share, it, but whatever. There's another company called Replay rather, Replay.io. Great company, and what they're doing is they're doing access control at the resolver level. So they've got a GraphQL API into something, and so the resolver essentially looks like if cookie has permission, then forward to the database, else like 401. So this is something that I feel like could be standardized almost by virtue of having a serverless provider be like, look, we'll handle that, send us a header and then we'll do the rest. um, I think teams are tired of figuring this stuff out themselves, especially front end teams.
Yeah, agreed. And I feel like it's also interesting because it's one of those problems that has always felt to me like, we're all doing a lot of work on the same thing here. Like we're all resolving this every single time we do it. It feels like this shouldn't be that hard to abstract. So I feel like we're getting there. What do you think is different now? Like why has it taken this long for us to get to the kind of services or architectures or even just technology that empowers us to do this?
That's a good. I think we're kind of sussing out things that are in demand based on past experience. Like back in the day, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Like just the simple act of deploying a static site was super hard, or at least harder than it needed to be. You need to have some type of like S3 account, and then you'd have to orchestrate it yourself. You need to like in Jenkins or something. When you get pushed to a repo, you would build that static site and then push that static site to S3. You'd have to manage all that yourself. And now we have things like Netlify over the past few years where you like drag and drop your static site into some drop zone on a front end and boom, it's deployed. And not only is it deployed, if it's a Git repo, you'll get like deploy previews on each PR. So you can like preview your front end. That's new. And so I think how we find ourselves where we are today is, we've solved the front end deployment problem. We've solved the, you know, sort of functions API deployment problem. with things like Cloudflare workers and netlify functions. So we've been solving a lot of problems across the stack, starting at the front end, and now we've made our way right all the way to the database. So I think it's just a matter of like pulling on a thread. And so now we're in the database part of this thread we're pulling on until we solve that too. But I like what you said earlier. It's we've solved these problems multiple times in our careers at multiple different companies. And at some point, we have to have this like zero one end thinking, of engineering, where like if we do something more than one time, it's generally a good idea to have this like be a reusable function that we can unit test. And I think the serverless offerings are exactly that. Like there's teams that it's their whole time full time job to like make database infrastructure awesome, so that if you're a new startup, you don't have to worry about that. I think that's where it's leading. So I wouldn't be surprised if like after the database portion of the thread we're pulling, we move on to something else. Maybe we make like Kubernetes or something really easy for people to use.
Gotcha, gotcha. So I feel like kind of the existing offerings, at least the stuff that I played with, like it wouldn't be that much of a jump for a like a NoSQL developer to be like, oh, okay, whatever, I can use this like database as a service and write like JSON like data to it and get it back from it, and that's fine. But to those developers that they're like, much more in the like relational database mindset, they've like spent their careers working on like like normalizing data and getting like effective indexes on keys to make it so we can query certain rows really fast when we have 10 million rows in this database when we're reading a million of them every 2 minutes. Like, how do we ensure that those people are kind of brought along as well as we're trying to push towards these like kind of data storage as a service?
Yeah, I mean, let me be really clear. I think SQL or relational databases are not going away ever. I was going to say anytime soon, but ever. Like, because look, there's a lot of value to be had with NoSQL or non-relational databases, particularly around like horizontal scale and geographic distribution and replicate. That whole story is effectively solved with NoSQL solutions, but there's a great cost to that, right? Like you lose normalization, you lose like you lose the standard query language even that so many people love in favor of what? Like you need to know a programming language to glue your unrelational stuff together in your application. So there's trade-offs, and I think SQL is this is going to be controversial, but I think SQL in so many ways is superior, barring the scale story, the distribution story. So I think really the future or the ideal is you give people like a relational model, but you just handle the scale side of things. Um, and then you get the best of both worlds. You get the problems that NoSQL solves, but also the joins and the normalization that people are used to, while still offering like regional failover and horizontal scalability and all of that as a service. You know.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I feel like yeah, it's much more difficult to get yourself into like an irrecoverable, data architecture or something if you're using a relational
Yeah.
database. Like there's just better rails in place, and you can like
And also
refactor
the
and figure
whole
things
thing
out.
about asset guarantees, which you just don't get with NoSQL. You haven't your transactions are not atomic. You don't get consistency, right? Like
Yep.
there's a whole area where NoSQL is just not a good choice. Like I would probably use it for a like button use case where you click a like button and you don't really care if it has 1K or 2K. You just it's important that
Right.
it's liked. But if I'm doing a bank
Hmm.
or something, there is no chance of me using NoSQL for areas where data is important, mainly because of
Yeah.
ACID. So
Yeah, right. I guess yeah. It in that realm, I feel like that's kind of it's an interesting topic because I feel that's the decision there of like what does my application care
yeah,
about? Do I care about like absolute data accuracy or like high availability and speed and like replications and having that? And that's kind of always informed, I guess, the engineers that are focused on those problems have used those decision points to figure out what they want to use. Like, what do I want to use for a data store? What like those the answers
yeah,
to those questions are what inform my
yeah,
decision. So how do we now that we're kind of moving, or I guess if our theory is correct that developers are going to keep pushing towards like data as a service, how do we make sure that those we have answers for all those kinds of questions, because I can't imagine technically where you're going to be able to have like the perfect solution for all of those
Yeah.
use cases across the board in any
Yeah,
given
and
product or
right. And I
configuration.
think that's why there's so many players in the space too, because there's companies like FaunaDB, for example, who give you NoSQL but with ACID. That's their whole thing. Um, but then you have to ask yourself the question: okay, that's great, but do I still want the ambiguity of NoSQL? Do I still want to stitch stuff together in my application logic? Versus there's other companies like I can't think of names right now, but there's other companies that give you the opposite. They give you like hosted SQL and they handle scale up planet scale. Great example. Um, but yeah, I think to cover most of the use, what I would love. Here's my dream, right? A multi-model serverless database where you can just throw data at it, structured, unstructured, doesn't matter, and it just works. And the reason why this is my dream is because then like if I have 10 months to build like a Tinder clone or something, I don't spend three of them like trying to figure out, oh shit, what do I do with the data? um, and I think that's so valuable, especially for companies like that are early or maybe with a small runway, or even older companies that are running out of runway. Like the less time you spend on essentially a solved problem, the better. So like here's something that would be fantastic is like this dream database that I have in mind, right, where you just throw data at it and it just works. What do I mean by just works? I mean, like even something as simple as a little switch element in the UI, where on one side you have eventually consistent, and on the other side you have immediately consistent. You just flick this thing, and that determines where you land on the cap theorem, right? Do you get consistency or availability? Like some, and that's essentially what I'm talking about, like a serverless database for developers that gives them the choice, um, and it feels like at the flick of a button. There's honestly outside of one company, there's no company that I know that is focusing on like developer experience, but for databases like the Vercel style developer experience, but like for databases. Maybe Vercel will start doing databases. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They'll design with that perspective. Do you think that like that is tenable? I guess like having my intuition is that there is like there's more to that decision, or more to how an application needs to function than flipping that switch. Like I would assume that the way even the front end behaves is going to be beholden to what it knows about the state of the database, like how it works. Like I when I'm sending up a new read or write operation, I care about like, is this an eventually consistent database, or do I know that my current value is right before I write it? And I feel like often that knowledge is like going down all the way to the what was formerly the API layer, but now in like serverless world, now it's either on the front end or like in a function or something. Do you think that it's possible to kind of write that logic in the front end or in like a serverless function without having to think about what setting is toggled, for example, like using your example in the UI for the database, on consistency?
I love that you brought that up because now I'm thinking, and by the way, it's my job to think about developer experience, right? So now I'm thinking, absolutely, what if a lot of these databases will just give you an API, right? And some of them don't even give you like direct access to the database, so you have no chance of executing a SQL statement or something. Um, so what if instead of the switch in the UI, what if the switch was a header you could send when you do a transaction on the database? God, can you imagine? Like you fetch to get data, but you add this header like X mode, consistency or availability. Ooh, wow! And then your apps can actually control that. Damn. So that's what I'm talking about. Like this type of developer experience doesn't exist, but I want it.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. It'd be super cool. Like in your front end, you like, whatever. My DB, like, here's the data I want to write. And it's just like, there's an options param I send in there. And in that, I can tell it like how I want this operation to perform if I need to always make sure I have the latest.
Yeah, write it, or even read it. Read this with immediate consistency, so it'll take a bit longer, or read it with eventual, or even write it with immediate or eventual. If you write it with the setting for immediate consistency, then what's going to happen is on the backend side, in a distributed environment, your primary will get the write, but not committed until all the replicas commit, and then so there is some time you'd lose, but that's effectively opt in from user land. Holy smokes! I I really want that.
Okay, well, yeah. If you ever guys, if guys, yeah, if you ever find yourself implementing it or on a team, you got to call back to the LogRocket podcast. Like this is where it all started. Um, yeah, cool. So this is, I guess, this is another good segue. Like in this, in your kind of in this talk, were you going to focus at all on how this kind of thinking about data like this affects how these kind of serverless apps are architected, or how devs are creating their new
Yeah,
architectures?
I was actually considering touching on that, but like the conference is BEJS, Belgium JS. So for me, it's super
Yeah,
important to have a strong appeal to the audience, which in this case it's in the name, right? The JavaScript developers. So in preparing for this
right.
talk, and kind of spoilers, I'm giving you a bit of the outline, is to come at it as a JavaScript developer myself, and kind of realize most JavaScript developers, especially if you're doing a high velocity job, like you don't get that much time to think about it. Like the general feeling on your team is, okay, I push this web view, this landing page, this whatever, and then there's an entire backend team to take care of that. And as a result, most JavaScript developers, especially front end developers, would have decisions to make. What do I need a database maybe for local testing or something. What do I do? Do I use SQLite? Why should I use SQLite instead of Postgres? Why should I use Postgres instead of Mongo? Like I feel for a lot of front end developers, and this is from even talking to people at conferences, like there's just some type of wild west confusion. And with that, I think more importantly comes imposter syndrome among front end developers. And this is not helped by the former kind of outgoing school of thought that JavaScript developers don't know anything; they just push pixels, right? That's how it used to be when I was starting out. And so with that comes a lot of like imposter syndrome and so on. And so the goal of my talk is to just eliminate that and give the JavaScript developers working on the front end or even in functions just more insight into how data has worked so far, and the next evolution of data infrastructure as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's interesting. So do you feel that this kind of the this old mindset of like, oh, JavaScript developers are just solving simple problems on the front end, do you think that that is um untrue more so now because they are dealing with the scalability problems directly on the front end?
I don't think it's more untrue now because like even if you go back to jQuery days or even MooTools days, like way before, right? Like there's always been like the browser wars are a thing, um, and you cannot ignore it. So like maybe the developers who are making web pages to work on just one browser at one screen resolution and one internet speed, maybe that's saying hey, there's not a lot of complexity there. But as far as I can recall, that's never been the case. Like there's always been a requirement to fulfill major browsers, sometimes even unreasonably back to like IE 11 or something, IE 10. But then there's also the network constraints. There's the visual impairments constraints. There's so many constraints. I don't think that statement has ever been true. Um, I'd even question like maybe the backend is oversimplified because we control all of the systems. Um, like there's fewer variables I can see there.
Yeah, yeah. It feels like a much more controlled. The backend feels like a much more controlled system. And yeah, just for clarity, I wasn't implying that it ever was true. I feel that that perception is starting to shift. So I was kind of getting at like what do you think is causing that change in perception? Do you think it is just there's more empathy in the developer space in general, or it's like there are like scalability concerns and stuff that are being pushed to the front end, so the back end engineers are like, this is a hard problem.
Yeah, no, I think the I think really it's just a community effort. Like speaking frankly, like full disclosure, I've been a part of so many conferences since like 2018, 2017, and in the beginning even there were some talks about the difficulties of being a front end engineer, um, and I would watch back end engineers in these talks literally just get up and leave. Like, oh come on, you don't know anything. That was the early days, but I've watched community events over time, and yeah, I think it's largely just community engagement where they highlight, here's actually, like for example, if somebody was to work at Spotify, right, there would be a talk about, here's all the problems we had to solve to get this player to work right on across multiple front end platforms, Apple Watch, TV, web browser. And then people were like, "Oh my goodness, I had no idea." I think it's just an ignorance thing. I think if you don't know the constraints, you'll always oversimplify.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's true. But anyway, I think yeah, it's good that that empathy is building, and I think it's also cool.
Yeah, and I think that's how we build empathy. Even is education, because the people who JavaScript developers don't know anything. They just didn't know. Um, could they have done the work to find out? Sure, but I don't personally. I don't think that way. Like, I 9 out of 10 times it's easier to just say they don't know anything instead of like go check for myself. That doesn't make it right, but it is the natural easier tendency. So I can kind of understand the other side from those days, but I'm generally glad education is doing its job, and leading to empathy. Yeah, like another example is a lot of people I feel like have major problems with downtime, and GitHub has had, unfortunately, a really bad quarter, right? Like, just incidents left and right, and sometimes, like, when GitHub's down, people can't work. So we've had people just say, "Yeah, GitHub's down. I'm done for today. Goodbye." Um, and that's super valid, because what are you going to do? Engineers, especially. So I feel like back in the day, again, like as I was starting out, there was always like hatred. Oh, these ops people are so incompetent. Fire them all. Um, but lately, as incidents have happened, I've seen a hashtag trending that I think is so beautiful. Is hashtag hug ops, right? Or you just go give your ops people a hug because they're under fire. I think, yeah, I'm seeing this shift in the tech industry, and I freaking love it.
Yeah, totally, totally. Yeah. Do you think that any of that? This is just kind of an interesting aside. Any of that that old the front end engineers aren't solving tricky problems. Do you think any of that was kind of stemmed from that? Blame the ops people like kind of anger. Like they're like, if I the back end engineers, if I fail, I bring the site down. Like it takes us a while to recover. Things are hard. If the front end engineer pushes a bug, we can like send out a rollback and fix it, and it's fine. Do you think that kind of negative energy that was always directed towards the ops
Yeah,
people kind of led to that
yeah,
chip on
yeah,
their
for sure.
shoulder?
And I think also, unmediated and uneducated, we're all super helpless. Like, if it wasn't for the community, I'd be the same. You know what I'm saying? I really cannot give enough credit to the
Hmm.
community around helping us be better people. Um, yeah. So yeah.
Cool, nice, nice. Well, let's bring this back in and talk about like JavaScript a little bit more. Yeah, like you talked. I guess yeah, you kind of started us off saying or talking about how this conference was really focused at JavaScript developers. Do you think that the uh, kind of the JavaScript engineers have spent less time kind of thinking about like database architecture and stuff than like the backend
Yeah,
engineers
for
have
sure. Because
historically?
especially like with the advent of Jamstack, uh, I think
Hmm.
everything's an API, JavaScript APIs and markup, right? So I think JavaScript developers spend a lot of time thinking about
Yeah.
APIs, but where those APIs lead to, like an API effectively is like a pipeline to a
Yeah.
backend system. So I think, yeah, they don't have as much
Hmm.
exposure. And before the Jamstack, the expectation, at
Yeah.
least in my career, like 2015-ish, was, hey, make this landing page look like this Figma, and here's a few APIs you can call. Good luck, right? So yeah, front end hasn't been as involved, I would say. And then you get Node.js, and even that I feel like hasn't been as closely involved. Like, at best, you'd get GraphQL that resolves to some database connection, but yeah, generally I feel like the space is young. Um, I think a big help there was a company called Hasura, that kind of helped Hasura, and also Apollo GraphQL with Apollo Server. I think these two companies really helped front end engineers move more towards backend stuff, including the whole GraphQL spec as well.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I feel like kind of Apollo. This is going to be a weird analogy, but I feel like Apollo kind of got like JavaScript and Node developers thinking about data in the way that like backend engineers that had always had like
Yeah,
an ORM to lean on, like kind of to help them inform how to make a database. It's like, oh well, I've got this object relational model, kind of like having an opinion about how I do things, and that opinion often would help you get like
yeah,
to a functioning end state. And I feel like Apollo kind of observed as those
definitely,
guardrails as well
definitely, and also the hype of
in the GraphQL
GraphQL.
world.
GraphQL was advertised as like a front end thing, I think from Facebook. Like ultimately, it's just a specification, right? But when it came out, this whole notion of, oh, you can just do one round trip to a server and back instead of multiple. That was a front end optimization. So it was like in this almost like this demilitarized zone between front end and back end that it just kind of came into. And I think that was for sure a segue for a lot of people, myself included, to that world.
Yeah, so I guess kind of that notwithstanding, what like where do you point front end devs who are kind of now due to these changes that we've been talking about in the industry, where like you kind of have this database as a service, it's much easier to use it from the front end directly, but you have to make those architecture decisions without necessarily building like an API or a backend. Like, how do you instruct JavaScript developer? How do how do you tell them where to look to be guided on how to do that properly?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, Personally, what I tell people is to build stuff. That's also how that's but I don't
yeah,
mean like build a
yeah,
company. I mean like take a weekend or sometime you have off and ask the question, hey, what happens when I want to communicate with my database? How does this work? And then just pull on the thread until you're led to some end. That's personally how I learn as well. Like for example, when I didn't understand like React, I just built a poor man's React clone just to kind of get it. And that's usually what I tell people, and it works generally so far. But just to circle back to one thing you said about querying a database from the front end directly, um, I don't think that's a good idea, uh, bec- because because you probably will have to authenticate and send a header or something, um, for authorization, right? And this is not something you do on the front end because
right.
um,
Yeah, yeah, totally. I was probably being overly generous. I wasn't thinking like write a SQL query. I was more like call a service that's doing your database management for you to give you the data you need. Yeah,
but even then you'd include your auth token on the client. So generally you would have a serverless function or something do that, and you'd send your front end code to the function. Just the whole thing is to obfuscate
yeah,
auth
yeah,
headers so that people can't like inspect your network tab and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Or you don't have to think about it at all. Yeah. So is there like kind of to close the circle then, and when thinking about data, like data on the front end, like from a data storage architecture, and then just like a data structure itself, like that we're using to read and write data, do you think that those need to remain like kind of the same shape or synonymous, or can we like start to separate those back, and these services can be storing data in a different way than we're thinking about it on the front end?
Yeah, I think it can help a lot to maintain some type of homogeneity between them, right? Because then front-end engineers can be included in back-end discussions because there's overlap. So I think it can help companies and teams to speak the same language. This is why I really admire the work like Prisma is doing, for example, giving TypeScript engineers a really nice ORM, um, because that's a backend. Like ORMs have been around on the backend for years before Prisma, and so bridging that gap, I feel like will it does so many things, right? Like it removes imposter syndrome to some degree from the front end engineers. It says, hey, look, now we speak the same language, and it allows collaboration in ways that were impossible previously. So yeah, I for sure think like maintaining how did you put it, synonymousness is is valuable for sure.
Maybe.
And that, like, whereas what's the alternative? Like, there's a divergence, but then the divergence between teams and orgs even gets bigger. And then ultimately the code gets less predictable. Therefore, we'll have scale problems. So no, I think synonymity is the way for sure.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of the presence of like GraphQL and Apollo, where it makes it easy to kind of like build up different data structures for the front end to consume from like disparate data sources in the back end that might not even have the same shape? Do you think that that is dangerous then? Like because it's so easy to like do transforms kind of through that API layer?
It depends, right? Like if you're using GraphQL as a batch API, which a lot of people do, um, then it's valuable. And I mean, other than the developer experience, it's definitely beyond a shadow of a doubt valuable for the user experience, as opposed to doing like 17 different round trips to 17 different services. So it's I think just in terms of the value prop. But what I do think is really important, because GraphQL is not a front end concern, right? It's a front end optimization to query a GraphQL API, but a GraphQL API itself is not a front end concern. It's a function slash middleware slash backend concern more than it is a UI like front end concern. So I still think having an ORM like Prisma or something on the front end, and then having that be homogeneous with your GraphQL API is super important. Um, but then if your backend GraphQL API proxies to like 17 different disparate services, like you said, that's entirely a backend thing. So I don't think if that differs from what the front end people are doing, I don't think it matters. As long as there's one element on the backend and one element on the front end that speak the same, I think it's fine. And that is the GraphQL server on the backend and the Prisma RM on the front end. Yeah, I think there has to be overlap in semantics at least one level on both sides for sure.
So in an organization, let's say where there is some kind of separation of concerns between teams, right? Like there's the front end team and the back end team, and now this. I'm sure this topic has kind of been beat to death, but like we have them. If we're talking about this middle layer, who do you think should own that? Like, should the front end developers be in charge of saying this is the shape I want the like GraphQL API to return, or like you said that the GraphQL API isn't really a front end concern in functionality; it's just how I get the data. So is that not? Should that not be in their purview?
If you draw a Venn diagram of front end and back end, like GraphQL is the intersect, right? Mhm. So I think that can perfectly model even the team participation. So if you've got 10 front end engineers, 10 back end engineers, you could allocate one of them each to fill the middle of that Venn diagram. You know, it has to be a collaboration. Otherwise it's going to get complicated. So yeah, I think in terms of resources, that middle layer is not as binary as the others. So I think we need at least one from both sides there.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think the collaboration definitely like, it tends to happen there. That is the way it is. I feel like one could make the argument just kind of given where we've gotten in our conversation that should be the purview of like the front end, right? Like they could use you could use your schema that like Prisma is spitting out and like okay, well I generate my GraphQL types just based on the ORM's types, and then like that then I just we need the backend team to make sure that they can satisfy our requirements. But it just seems like an overly kind of optimistic or naive way to do it because the backend teams are going to have concerns about like performance in the way that layer is like querying the data.
Exactly, and this is why you can I think any team that just has one team be responsible for that is going to be in a lot of trouble. Um, yeah, because you can't separate those. Um,
Yeah, agreed. Well, I feel like we've covered a lot so far. Is there anything else kind of on this in this topic, or what you're planning to cover in your upcoming talk that you wanted
yeah,
to touch on or
I
talk
wanted to
about?
touch on the notion of like databaseless development. Like I think this is where it's going. Like a lot of people talk
Mm-hmm.
about serverless and make jokes like, oh, but there are servers, all the while not getting that it is serverless, like for you the user, you literally don't provision or scale anything, and it's reduced to just an API usually. um, I think we're headed more towards a databaseless world, where other people manage and whatever your database is, and you just get an API. This is, I think it's valuable for multiple reasons. We've talked about them already, but I think one of the biggest reasons is then being able to globally distribute and query your database from the edge, from CDN edge. That's nuts. Like we see some users of Zeta, for example, use something like Cloudflare workers to query their stuff, and they get these like ridiculously fast reads from their database, which unheard of in the past. So I think that's something. And I also think, it's not just databases that are being hidden behind serverless implementations, but also like entire data infrastructures. Like like we don't want to do this at Zeta, but we have the potential to have companies exist that just don't have ops teams at all. Um, because, or yeah, actually, you don't need an ops team at all if you're a newer company, which reduces the barrier to entry. So anyone can start something, and if they use things like Vercel or Netlify, right, for their static sites and functions, ops team is not needed. But you would still need an ops team for your database until Zeta shows up and says, "Hey, we give you like the same thing that Vercel does, but for databases." And then so I think, and what I mean by data infrastructure in this case is not just the database, but like at some point of scale, everyone needs and has a search engine. Literally, like Instagram, Reddit, YouTube. search is super important. So I'm talking about the concerns of like a database, a search engine, and some type of in-memory KV store. Like these three things always go together. And so when I say like database list infrastructure, what I mean is all of that stuff becomes someone else's problem. And so then I can just like build an app that uses it, and I don't have to worry about like sharding and indices and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. I think yeah, like I totally feel that. I am that way myself. Like when I'm spinning up a new project, I try to like pull the like as little of that database ops work as I can. I like now I'll find some service like make it super easy. But I do feel that if you're a new company trying to get started, even if you don't have resources to dedicate an ops person to it, I would theorize that many companies are still choosing to kind of manage a part of that database themselves. Either they're like spinning up a managed Postgres instance or whatever. They're spinning up a managed service somewhere to give them a database for fear of vendor lock-in, like at the database level, and being unable to kind of adapt or make a change if they're running into an issue. What do you say to those companies that kind of have that reservation?
You even like lock-in is one thing, but also just the basic notion of privacy. um, you'll sign your contracts with whatever database service, and they have terms in there, terms of service, like your data is yours, it belongs to you. Awesome, we do that too, but like you don't know, no, you know what I'm saying, like you don't have physical access to the machine. So I think those reservations are super valid. Um, and for lock-in specifically, that's why what we're doing at Zata, and I think a lot of others may follow suit, I don't know, is we make it so easy for people to leave, like data exporters, because we don't really like, we don't believe in holding people hostage. Like if you're happier at Planet Scale, then go use Planet Scale, we'll make it easy for you. Um, because and this is kind of getting philosophical, I even believe like in interpersonal relationships, like if somebody's better friends with someone else and they don't want to be my friend anymore, then I have no reason to be like, no, stay with me, like just like go be happy. That's that's all we want, like go be happy. Yeah, so I think the concern of lock-in is super valid. We as a company recognize that, and we're trying to actually make it easy for people to leave. And also, having companies concerned about like who owns the data and so on, those are valid, and we try to make those concerns non-concerns. We try to massage them and say, hey, it's be super open about these things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that's awesome. I think it's super cool that you guys are like making it easy to get data out. But I guess like my personal fear, like if I'm starting a big project and like looking at these tools, or even like looking at Firebase or something, it's like, well, my architecture is like all of this engineering work I'm doing, even if it's saving me a lot, I'm like I'm saving time by committing to a certain like API shape, right? Like I'm making design decisions that are kind of beholden to the assumptions that I'm making about this service that I'm using. Like is there do you think is there are we missing maybe a layer of abstraction that may be helpful at some point to like make it swappable, like so I can like find a different service provider to do this?
If lock-in is a real concern, and it's introducing coupling right between your code and some vendor, I think it's an awesome idea to just have that Venn diagram GraphQL thing in the middle, that your app, all your front end and all your clients, which probably you're going to have way more clients than you are backends as a company. I'm talking about like iOS app, Android app, website, and these clients speak to this single GraphQL API that then talks to whatever vendor you want, which you can then change out. Even you can make it swappable. So I think, yeah, that's huge, and I think GraphQL is uniquely suited to do such a thing. Um, that's a really good point. I think more companies that are concerned about this should do that for sure.
Yeah, I think people are aware of it, right? Like that's why these tools are cropping up. This is not like some big revelation. Like this is kind of what people are thinking about. But yeah, it's cool to see kind of vendors like ensuring that their products are swappable kind of in that regard too. Like, and like if you've done a little bit of work as an engineering team, like you can make it so your architecture isn't super beholden to our like paradigm. um yeah, cool. Well, thank you for answering a couple of the tough questions there. I know I was kind of like getting into it. Yeah, is there anything else you wanted to talk about? Anything upcoming, anything you want to plug?
I'm I'm excited about a lot of conferences. So Zeta for whatever for us, we love kind of hanging out with developers. Actually, DevRel is one of our biggest pillars on which we're trying to build a company, because like we're not doing anything new. We're just wrapping existing tried and tested things: Postgres, Elasticsearch, DynamoDB, and the name of the game for Zada is developer experience, right? Like we just want it to feel like premium. We want to give you a nice white glove database experience while taking all the shit out of it, and we do it ourselves. So that's yeah. So it's developer communities. We're going to be at React Amsterdam, Cascadia JS. There's a whole bunch. But yeah, what I did want to plug is SATA. We care about developer experience, and we're all about giving developers the most premium and best developer experience with databases and data infrastructure as we can. So we're in private beta. If you want us to hook you up, we can. So that's my only plug.
Nice, nice, awesome, cool. Yeah, we'll be linking the show notes for sure. But yeah, thank you for joining me, Tejas. I appreciate it. Like this has been an awesome conversation. Usually we're not able to kind of get in the weeds to this degree, so yeah, this has been great.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for having me.